Hello there! So, alternating is a playstyle that involves switching between key inputs for each object clicked. An alternating map should therefore be a map with high enough rhythm density to require switching between key inputs for each object clicked. A map that's too fast to single tap, so forced alternating due to map design basically. Stream heavy maps and the WUB maps I talked about recently may often force alternating due to their mainly 1/4 beat rhythm structure, but they aren't what people usually classify as alternating maps. A conventional alternating map is designed with rhythm, slider velocity, and object orientation choices, vaguely similar to those first popularized by the well-known mapper Val0108. Val was the first mapper whose name I found reason to remember. When I started playing Osu, all I really cared about in maps was the songs backing them, but Val made me change that perspective. Without any mapping knowledge, I noticed that maps from this one guy were repeatedly enjoyable, especially those that required alternating ordinary half-beat rhythms due to their high BPM values. Instead of searching for maps of songs that I knew, I began searching for Val's name and came across many more maps by him that fit the style I was looking to play. So, what about these maps from Val was noteworthy though? Why was he able to grow a name for himself as the guy who created these intense high BPM alternating maps which any new player like myself could enjoy despite not being skilled at the game? Looking closely at one of his most popular alternating maps should make that clear. Sitting at 280 BPM, Talent Shredder is my favorite of all maps by Val, partially for nostalgia reasons, and partially for how effectively it showcases the classic methodology behind high BPM mapping. Rhythmically, the map is as simple as possible. Half-beat filler is repeated almost everywhere, telling players that regardless of spacing, objects will always be clicked at the same interval. Any breaks from the usual half-beat rhythms are telegraphed to players in the most understandable ways as well, ensuring that readability is not a factor to worry about in this map visually overcrowded by its high-density rhythms. For example, look at rhythm in the first key eye. There are 3 gaps in rhythm longer than half a beat, each of which is mapped with stacks. Because most half-beat rhythms are immensely variable in spacing, some being small and some being large, spacing apart these irregular rhythms would make them harder to interpret. They'd be visually the same as most half-beat rhythms, potentially causing misreads. Despite a few half-beat rhythms being stacked too, stacking these irregular rhythms was the best choice because the lack of movement allows players to easily stop and pay attention to approach circles. Players can most easily read each irregular rhythm. And of course, it helps that Val established this idea right from the start, where the only 3 full beat gaps in rhythm in the first 7 seconds of mapping were stacked as well. Along with this, the map contained absolutely no 4th beat rhythms, like no triples and no streams at all. Anything more dense than half-beat clicking was mapped passively, like this arrangement of 1/4 sliders. They cover 1/4 drum roll, but they're played as active half-beat rhythms, so again, players only need to think about the simplest rhythm choice. All that's well managed, but nothing too noteworthy. Basic readability concepts like that had been established before Talent Shredder. Coupling that with intense yet easy to play spacing, however, is what Val popularized. Spacing after circles in this map is almost always low. 41% of the time, half-beat circles are stacked on top of the next object. 53% of the time, they're spaced according to distance snap. And only 6% of the time, they're spaced like this. Yes, I counted. That's only 12 relatively highly spaced jumps after circles in the entire map, none of which are consecutive. They either lead into sliders or into large gaps in the timeline. There are never multiple highly spaced circles in a row, reducing difficulty by a huge amount. Now, compare that to spacing after sliders in this small part of the map. And again at 50% playback, since that was pretty fast. Spacing after slider ends is essentially the opposite of circles, almost always highly spaced. In these 3 seconds of mapping, there are 10 instances of extremely high spacing after sliders, the only exceptions being the 2 times when sliders lead into circles with distance snapped spacing, a deliberate move by Val to give players a chance to more accurately aim each linear pattern. Slider leniency used in this fashion is what Val's alternating maps prioritized. If you've heard people call alternating maps underweighted before, this is why. Star rating only takes into account the spacing between clicked objects, circles, and slider heads. Slider bodies and slider tails are therefore irrelevant, so high spacing after sliders barely adds anything to star rating. But because slider velocity is set so high on these Val-styled alternating maps, players feel a need to follow slider bodies and not screw up combo, making star rating not fully indicative of actual difficulty. The same could be said about all maps, but because spacing for half-beat circles is always low on these maps specifically, star rating is as misleading as can be. These lowly spaced circles are the things making up star rating, yet these huge spacings are the things that make up a lot of the difficulty. But hey, that doesn't matter for a lot of people because these maps are fun to play for sure, even for scrubs like me of the past. So, high slider velocity, careful slider leniency usage contrasted with low spacing of circles, and simplistic, readable rhythm like this was the key to Val's popular high BPM mapping. It made what appears near impossible to play a piece of cake, which is why so many mappers were influenced by him. By that, I mean Val both influenced mappers during his heyday and mappers far after he left the scene. Like PKK is a mapper who's been keeping Val's legacy of classic alternating maps alive by mapping a bunch of high BPM songs in the same fashion. His most popular map is this 300 BPM jazz one, but he's got a bunch of others on his user page, including some of the same songs Val mapped years earlier. It's a direct tribute in ways that are obvious and some ways that are more subtle. If PKK had been around when I was a new player, he would have probably been one of my favorite mappers just because he mapped in a way fairly similar to Val. But yeah, that's the classic form of alternating maps. Maps inspired by Val which keep intensity high and playability under strict control for a wide audience to enjoy. Some maps are still made like this, but since then, mapping has of course undergone a lot of changes. The standard difficulty for maps has increased, and along with that, the capabilities of players. That being said, modern alternating maps aren't quite the same as their classic predecessors. To start with, decimal difficulty settings introduced mid-2014 alleviated that visually overcrowded feeling Val's maps had by permitting approach rates beyond 9 but not so far as 10. And from there, a lot of mappers began to try out movement on alternating maps far more extreme than Val ever attempted. For example, this is one of those modern alternating maps. Rhythm is overly simplistic and slider velocity is generally high, as is the same with classic alternating maps, but spacing is different here. While Val's maps encourage fluid, linear motion between consecutive circles, this map encourages precise, snapping movement because of high spacing and sharp angles between consecutive circles. Players need to rely on more than just slider leniency to handle this strenuous design, and that's made clear by its no longer underweighted star rating. Really though, all this means is modern alternating maps are ordinary maps with simplistic but dense rhythm and fast slider velocity. There's no special design like Val's maps used. Thinking about it from a mapper's perspective, I really value the craftsmanship it takes to create a map that's practical to play while still being just as intense as the song deserves, as Val's maps executed perfectly. These maps though are just ordinary maps. However, in some ways, that sentiment about being easy to play has also carried over into these modern alternating maps because of the correlation between speed and conventional playability. It's story time. 2.5 years ago, this map of mine was disqualified for its inappropriate background and a few gameplay issues in the hardest difficulty. While I say a few, that's just how it was posed. In reality, the QAT believed this difficulty was overall garbage, and I initially didn't understand why. It was organized in essentially the same way as any of my prior ranked map sets, and when questioning a few QAT members, I concluded that it's normal to be more strict with playability on faster songs. I should have been able to figure that out without their help really. Having to move faster between objects means less time to adjust for mistakes, and therefore higher BPM maps are better suited for more natural movement. That ideology stuck with me from this point onwards and continued to show relevancy in my future map sets. Like, I remember when my King for a Day map set was qualified, I visited various live streamers who happened to be playing my brand new ultra cool 6-star map and they said it sucked.
What is this? This is so awkward to play.
It was a pain to play for nearly everyone. Again, it wasn't too different from my usual way of mapping, but because of the high tempo, 226 BPM, its problems may have just been more pronounced. I also recall my Helena map set, basically my first alternating map. I made an expert difficulty and received another expert guest difficulty from Kaishiro, a mapper with experience creating these alternating maps already. Out of curiosity, I asked a few people to compare both of our difficulties and the results were what I should have expected. The majority of opinions stated that Kaishiro's map was smoother to play, and even some told me that I just wasn't ready to map a 252 BPM song because of the precise gameplay control it required. It's harsh, but that was along the lines of what I was expecting. From here, I decided to make high BPM maps with as simplistic movement as possible. I remapped my highest difficulty for Helena with circular flow and only sharp angles, which players said was exactly what they were looking for. I mapped that previously shown modern alternating map as well, and I've had a lot of people tell me it's their favorite map of mine despite it being, well, in my opinion, boring. It's just basic half-beat rhythm and simple movement attached to a 270 BPM song, whose intensity probably carries the interest of any players appreciating it. The same could be said about my map of State of the Union, or the countless guest difficulties labeled double BPM on my user page. They're modern alternating maps that a lot of people enjoy, but they're ultimately just kinda boring. Storytime over. My point should be obvious by now. Among mappers and players, there's always been a very clear stigma towards unusual playability, and that's made clearest on alternating maps. While the classic style of alternating maps promoted easy playability through low spacing of circles, modern style alternating maps do so through conventional movement concepts, and those concepts are enforced by the majority of mappers and players through criticism. That's all because of the correlation between speed and conventional playability. While I can appreciate the mapping skill it takes to organize high BPM jumps in a clean and playable way, doing that in my own mapping no longer interests me, which is why I haven't made any modern alternating maps in a long time. For my own sake, I've been instead mapping songs with tempos more along the lines of what's average for Osu maps, stuff in the realm of 150 to 200 BPM, which doesn't make me feel pressure to conform to ordinary movement concepts. Criticism of unusual gameplay isn't what I'm worried about though. It's more that everything I've learned about mapping revolves around this faster maps require more comfortable movement ideology. I am not satisfied with my own modern alternating maps if they use unconventional movement. Like a few months ago, I made a map of the Don Don song that's basically a meme on Osu. It forces uncomfortable momentum changes with linear jumps, and it includes tons of unintuitive slider leniency abuse. It's not smooth to play, but it's only 175 BPM. It's entertaining and slow enough to allow corrections in error with movement, so I think it's okay despite not being comfortable to play. However, if I had mapped the same thing at 275 BPM, I probably would hate the map. I wouldn't stand how hard it is to aim these linear patterns, and I'd pressure myself into changing the movement concept to something more normal, because the correlation between speed and playability has been ingrained in me since I started mapping. So, yeah. Alternating maps are fun to play, but I don't really have fun mapping them anymore. However, maybe that'll change as the norms of mapping become even more difficult. What's high BPM may someday just become average BPM, and modern alternating maps will become just modern maps. But until then, I'll just stick to mapping ordinary songs. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.